Hello, everyone. This is Alexander Fernandez with another edition of Video Games Real Talk. We have an amazing guest today, Jacob Navok of Genvid Technologies. Jacob, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Doing well, man. Doing well. I mean, it's been super busy for you. I mean, looking and seeing about all the news and all the press that you guys are getting. I mean, you guys are doing a hell of a job. So, why don't you tell the audience what you got going on right now, and let's just get in on it.
Great. Thank you. So we just launched, I guess it was a week ago at this point in time, PacMan Community on Facebook. It's a brand new PacMan game that has real-time multiplayer, the ability for people who are streaming the game to have their audience jump in and play with them, the ability to have millions of people interact together with an AI Pac-Man and ghosts and help them kind of like a Facebook plays Pac-Man, as well as create your own mazes and have those mazes appear not only for other people to play, but also for those AI Pac-Man and ghosts to try to accomplish in this never-ending kind of Sisyphean, uh, endless uh, version of the watch mode.
So let me ask you something. This concept takes me back to the old days about when I used to go to the pizza parlor and there was that bar or the cocktail version of Pac-Man, and we'd watch and play at the same time. But of course, you could never modify anything, and we were playing in a social environment. How did this come together? And it sounds exciting. I mean, but how did you get this deal going?
Well, we have to wind back the clock a little bit to Rival Peak, which was the project that we'd worked on for Facebook about a year and a half ago. Um, so this was a interactive television show that we launched last December, and uh, we were trying to create an interactive version of Big Brother. So we had a TV series starring Will Wheaton, and it was summarizing what was happening in these 24/7 live streams, but those live streams weren't of players, they weren't of people, they were of these AI, and they were available 24/7. The audience could tell the AI what to do, help them make decisions, help them craft and cook and build things, read their stories. And every interaction that you did with the AI helped their AI score, and that score decided whether they would survive in the show or not. Um, so we built this project with Facebook. It was pretty successful. And in the next steps for the partnership, we wanted to explore something that was one, more game oriented, and two, would allow us to build a foundation for our future efforts. So if next year we'll announce the kind of semi sequel to Rival Peak. If you wait to see that one, you'll see some of the features that we've put into Pac-Man will appear in new and very compelling ways, and then tied back into the kind of story-driven experience that you saw in Rival Peak. So we wanted to take a very well-known IP, start to build in new feature sets and new ideas, and use that as a springboard for where we were going to take the future of our tech and these kind of experiences that we call miles, or massively interactive live events.
So let's talk about Miles because I think this is so cutting edge. I mean, Miles is basically literally, I mean, the past 18 months has really where it started to pick up, and you've coined that phrase. Or I think, was it you or Matthew Ball who coined it? Which one of you guys actually made that word up?
Together, so we put together an essay in, I guess it was May 2020,
Hmm.
um, called Cloud Gaming and the Games That It Will Create. In that essay, we said that the future opportunity for game streaming was miles or massive interactive live events. Um, this came from Genvid's original pitch deck in 2016, where we called them epic interactive events. And IE doesn't sound as good, so Ball twisted it around a little, came up with miles instead. We replaced the word epic with massive, pretty much, and added live in there, and that's where miles came from. And so we debuted it in that essay, and we've been using that as a kind of roadmap or guiding star ever since.
Now, I think this is important. Your journey to get to Genvid and Miles, the success you're having today, it goes way back. And the thing about video games real talk is that we go through the journey of people. We talk about the struggles, the successes, the setbacks, and what it takes to actually get here. Genvid is a fascinating story. Your story is fascinating as an entrepreneur. And I'm hoping that we can go through that today, kind of share how did you get here and basically where did this concept come from? Because I mean, there was another life before Genvid, and I'm hoping that you can tell us just how did you come up with this? How did you get here? And just take us through the process.
Sure. So I joined Square Enix about 12 years ago at this point in time, and I ran worldwide business development and strategy for the holdings company, which is the parent of the Square Enix group. So I worked directly for their longtime CEO, Yoichi Wada. And when I joined the company, it was just at the start of what we'll call cloud gaming 1.0. It was when Steve Perlman was building OnLive, and Dave Perry was making Gaikai, and we had a couple other companies come out. And I was asked by Wada-san to go and investigate and look at these cloud gaming companies. See, Wada-san had a theory, and it actually stretched back for a very long time. When he joined Square, this is before he merged with Enix, he actually was the person who merged those two companies. Um, they were building Final Fantasy XI, which was the first major Japanese MMO. And if you look at what they'd done with Final Fantasy XI, they moved positional data to servers, allowed for a new type of content to occur, which was the MMO, or a massive multiplayer game, that resulted in a new business model, which was subscription. And that subscription business model basically saved the company, which is to say, as you know, the old story about Final Fantasy, they spent all their money on it. It was the last game they could produce and came out, and thankfully it did well and they got money in. But that was the cycle for Square for a very long time. They would spend all their money on a Final Fantasy, they would be nearly bankrupt, they would release the title, they would have revenue again, and the cycle would rinse and repeat. And once we got to Final Fantasy XI, where we started to have recurring subscription revenue come in, we began to see a smoothing out of the company's revenue flows. It became the single-handedly most profitable game experience that they'd ever created, because they were able to generate hundreds of millions in revenue through just subscriptions alone. So Wada-san looks at this, and again, this is like 2002, 2003, 2004. He says, well, if we just had positional data move to servers, what happens if we start to move AI and physics and rendering and other aspects? And if you read his shareholder letters in 2004 and 2005, he talks about the network being the future of games. He speaks about where he predicts gaming was going. And so by the time we get to 2009, and we have these companies coming to our offices and demoing basically Final Fantasy streaming to every device from a server, and he says, well, maybe the future is here now. Jacob, go find me the company that will help us build the next great Final Fantasy, something new that can only be done on servers. And that was the mission he gave me. So I took that mission. I met with the various parties, and I came back to him and I said, Wada-san, I don't think any of these companies are going to be able to do what it is that you wanted. They just created an encoding scheme. Right? They take a PC game, they stream it as is. There's no offloading of physics or other kind of things that you're imagining to create new types of content. And his response, as typical for him, was, great, that's an opportunity for us. Let's spin up an R&D division and see if we can take this business ourselves. So in 2010, we put together a research division that we called Project Flare. A few years later, we actually debuted it. I think it was 2013 E3. You can go and find VentureBeat and other articles about Project Flare from that time. And the R&D was pretty successful. We managed to create some new types of game experiences using physics and AI and other things streaming from servers. Eventually, we turned that into a subsidiary, Shinra Technologies, that I ran, which was named after the evil corporation from Final Fantasy VII. And we started to build out what different types of cloud gaming experiences could be like. But one thing happened that we didn't expect when we began working on this, and that was the rise of the live streaming platforms, which is to say, 2009, 10, 11, as we're working on cloud gaming, there was no Twitch. There was certainly no YouTube live streaming or Facebook live streaming. And the growth of game streaming took us by surprise. In particular, it was a moment that I won't forget, which was Twitch Plays Pokemon, where a million people played a game over a stream together. Pokemon wasn't installed or running on their local machines. They didn't have a copy there on their computer necessarily. And they were all helping this AI trying to get it to beat the game together. Kind of memes and stories that came out from that community really burned themselves into my brain. And I pointed it to Wada-san. I said, maybe we have cloud gaming all wrong. Maybe it's not about playing a game over a stream, but people collaborating, millions of people helping to create impact effect content together. And that stuck in my head for a while. It became the inspiration for this company, Genvid, which helps to create games on the cloud. That's what you see in Rival Peak, helps to create games that stream, but isn't about playing. It's about being able to help participate, work with a community to shape the outcome, to collaborate together as viewers and input and effect back into it. So that's a little bit of the story. Obviously, there's a lot more nuance and detail that I can go into, but that's where the idea and inspiration for Genvid came from.
I think it's fascinating that you saw this just through the investigation and realizing that participatory gaming, working as a team, people actually helping each other was what was basically driving a tremendous amount of engagement. That moment that you saw that you saw people really working together and playing together. Did you was it an instant like, wait a second, we should turn on a dime, or was it more just like, let me process that, and then a couple of years later you realized that's the moment, that's really what we need to be doing?
So we saw it as an opportunity when we were at Square Enix, but we were building games for players, and that was the objective, the goals that we were given. And so we had to work within that rubric. It wasn't until I left Square that I was able to focus exclusively on the area that I was interested in, which was the kind of viewer experience, or that massive event style experience that wasn't necessarily about a person playing. And to explain or to understand this, typically what the expectation is from a game developer or a game publisher is, I have a game product. It could be a free to play product like Fortnite, or a $60 package disc that you buy for a PlayStation or an Xbox. There is a player. I've sold this product to a player. And then there is an audience from somebody who is streaming the game, Ninja, Shroud, what have you. And we are trying to market to that audience to play our game. In other words, influencers, streamers, Twitch, what have you, are simply marketing, get more people to buy our product. The viewers themselves are not the revenue source up until they have purchased the product and become a player. That is the mindset of a game developer or a game publisher. And that's not wrong. I'm not implying that this is incorrect in any way. That is their business. What I thought was, there is an additional opportunity for the game industry, not just about selling more games to people who want to play games, but also to monetize that audience, to treat the viewing audience not as marketing, but as revenue. That you could sell items or advertising or interactions to people who are watching content and who want to lean in. And where they lean in, that spectrum of interaction that you give to them is the opportunity that hasn't existed up until now. Because before this, you had a $0 or $60 revenue bet from them, which was to say, either the audience member didn't purchase your product and you were earning zero from them, or they did purchase your product and you were getting $60 or whatever your ARPU was from your free to play title. And what I was suggesting was, those people may never become players of your game. They may never buy it for $60, but if you monetize them, you can get income from them because they wanted to participate, to interact, to be part of that content, but didn't install or purchase it. And this is a very hard line to get to, because if you are a traditional game designer or a game developer slash publisher, and you are thinking about your player audience, you will always assume that the ROI from someone who is fully immersed and who has paid you $60 is going to be more than the audience member who is casual, jumping in and out, busy doing other things during their day. Another way to look at this is the following: the average American watches about 5 hours of television a day. Of that, only about an hour is immersive, I'm paying attention, Game of Thrones style experiences, and the rest of it is cooking, cleaning, it's on in the background, I'm half paying attention. And so games demand your immersion, they demand your attention. You do not move forward in Call of Duty unless you push the joystick. You do not crush candy in Candy Crush unless you tap it. These games exist purely for you, and so if you are not immersed, if you are not focused on them, if you are not paying attention, if it's not your 1 hour of Game of Thrones, you will not be monetizing that game. And I'm saying to the industry, there is an entire 4 hours of additional time you could be taking from people and monetizing them rather than trying to convert them into players. Treat the audience as your revenue opportunity. And that's what I have thought is the opportunity for Miles, the idea that there is an audience there who may be lean back, who may be watching, but that if you create moments for them, if you treat them as their own customer base and say, here's some interactions, do you want to lean in further? Do you want to take control? Do you want to have this kind of VIP pass for this interactive experience? You can begin to generate revenue from them directly rather than needing to convert them into players.
What's fascinating about this is that you literally introduced television to the video games industry, a version of it in which spectators, watchers, which are the bread and butter of media, specifically broadcast media, has another life and now even greater opportunity. And I remember when we were talking about this when you first presented it to me. God, it must have been in 2017, I think is when it's 2016. When I saw your stuff, I immediately leapt towards the idea of like, wow, this will be great for advertisers. And it wasn't from a standpoint of wanting to talk about it from an ad tech perspective, but just from the idea of exactly what you've just said. There are people watching, people have it on. They want to participate when they want to participate. And the fact that you've been able to enable people to lean in when they want, lean back when they want, and provide a revenue stream to a business model that until this came up, either you paid 60 or you paid zero, is phenomenal. And I'm wondering, when you went about telling this story to people, did you encounter pushback where people were like, no, kid, that's never going to happen? Or what was the response? How did people feel about it?
There is a general understanding that audiences who watch games are massive, that people are busy, and they don't have the time necessarily to focus or be immersed. At the same time, in any industry where there is an entrenched, significant revenue opportunity, as is in games, you always have an ROI problem. I could spend $1 of investment and get a guaranteed return on an ROI that I know for players, or I could spend $1 and try to attack this audience question, but I don't know what that ROI is yet. This is a very reasonable set of calculations for people who lack the additional time or money to be able to invest into multiple products and bets. And so for most game publishers or game studios who have to hit their P&Ls, who have to make sure that they are developing on time and on budget and getting the ROI that they are expected to get, it is natural for them to say, this is fascinating, it's interesting. When you can guarantee me what my ARPU or revenue output looks like, that's when I can begin to invest my dollar. That makes sense. But there are places, studios that like to make bets on the future, who have conviction or understanding, and tech companies, specifically ones like Facebook, who have done a lot of work with us, that understand that there is promise to come here yet. And so we've typically worked with studios, publishers, and tech companies who understand and appreciate the opportunity that's here, that understand that this revenue opportunity that I've been speaking about still doesn't have a distinct ROI that you can measure yet. But I believe that the moment it does, and that moment is coming, because we are building that content, that the gates will swing fairly wide open because we'll be able to prove in what the ROI is going to be for this type of content.
So for the audience that's out there thinking, okay, this is great, it sounds fascinating. Can you explain a little bit of how it works? Obviously people are, obviously you have to see it to believe it, but at the same time, the way you illustrate this and the fact that we can understand leaning in, leaning out, that's phenomenal. How does one go about doing a mile experience? I mean, what does that look like?
So let's take Rival Peak as an example. And as I mentioned, this is an interactive television show that we built. It's all built in a game engine. So we've got these instances of Unity that are actually streaming from game servers. But unlike a Stadia or an xCloud, it's not I have a game and you have a game and we've got one GPU per person who is watching. Rather, it's like a Twitch stream. There's one stream being generated, and a million people could be watching it, and it's still using one GPU. So we're watching a character. He's streaming from his Unity instance. And there is a bit of metadata coming from the game engine. That metadata could be where the character's position is, what he's saying, things that he's doing, help that he needs. And we have a JavaScript and HTML5 overlay that allows us to send input back into the game instance. That could be tell the character to do this, tell the character to do that, read this story, participate here. Of course, if a million people are watching it, you can't all tell the character what to do together. So we create a design. Could be as simplistic as voting. I'm not a huge fan of voting. It could be little mini games that we have to play in order to push a character toward an outcome. It could be things that we're exploring for our next set of content, which is bidding, where you play, you generate points, and you bid against other users in order to tell the characters what to do and decide an outcome. But regardless, the point is that the audience makes a decision, creates that decision as an aggregate input back into the game instance. The game instance renders it and then encodes and streams it back to the entire audience. And all of this happens in milliseconds. So it works not dissimilar to how you would expect a Twitch plays Pokemon to work, but it's built from the ground up with very rich synchronized overlay. And synchronized overlay is actually very important. We can get basically nearly to the frame, which means that we can begin to allow through the overlay you to manipulate what it is that you're watching. Imagine being able to shoot a gun and see the results visually in the video. Be able to, as you know, your team and my team worked on for Project Monarch that we debuted back in September of this year, tap on different creatures and help prevent them from attacking the main character. All of this happens in such a way that the audience doesn't even understand that they're playing video. It looks like they're participating in a game. It looks like they're actually controlling or have something installed, or that they are the ones who are, deciding it. We want the audience to feel like their participation matters, because it does. And you do that all through UI UX design. But regardless, the technological underpinnings remain the same. There's a game, it streams, it sends metadata, we take input from the audience, and we reflect it back into the visuals that you're watching.
So when you basically are designing these, I mean, you're designing for basically massive interactions, but effectively from a standpoint that people are going to be looking and being fascinated with what they're seeing. From a standpoint of basically like brands or entertainment companies that are wanting to do this, is there a certain way they need to be approaching this, a way of thinking about designing these, or is it best to just say, hey, you know what? I mean, obviously come to Genvid, but is it really? Do they need to break their way of thinking to basically make these possible?
Usually, when you're thinking about game experiences, you think about the player, you think about one individual hero's journey. And then separately, if you're thinking about an audience experience, you're thinking about a shared narrative, a shared kind of emotional reaction you want that audience to have to your ad, to your content. So, how do you enable the audience to have a shared emotional journey while also giving them some minor feeling of agency. You're kind of marrying the two concepts together. Where the balance is here, how do you focus on either remote emotional reaction and or that feeling of input back into the experience? We call that the um, spectrum of engagement. That's, I think, where the rub is for most agencies or people who are looking to create unique types of interactive advertisements. But that spectrum really depends on what kind of experience you want to create. In other words, it's not go too much into audience or too much into play design. It's what do we want to build? What kind of reaction do we want to have from this content? And then we'll see where it fits on the spectrum and design from there. I think that's fairly different than the way in which you've created up until now.
Absolutely. It's every time we talk about this, I always think, to me, it feels more like you're making a broadcast, that you're doing film, you're making a TV show. I mean, it feels more towards that. It feels more towards that than anything else. I mean, is that a proper way of thinking about this?
Certainly more than what you would normally do in a game, unless I guess you're Hideo Kojima and you're building interactive movies. And generally in game design, you're thinking about how can I create recurring loops that are fun and sticky. And the story and emotional reaction is just a step on the path toward getting people to interact more or be immersed more or play more of your product. And here, what we're saying is actually the majority of your audience may never input, may simply watch, or may have the lightest touch, chat, or a tap at most into your content. And then further in the funnel, people will interact more and interact more and interact more up until you get that top 1% where people truly are engaged and almost immersed close to a player. But that you've widened your audience so that people who don't necessarily want to be focused or immersed don't have to be. And if they want to simply lean back and watch and engage lightly, they can. And their experience, their enjoyment of that content is the same as the people who are fully immersed in it. That is, I think, the major difference here. And that is why it is, in some ways, closer to film or television and movie development, because we have to think about the audience that is watching it and not just how sticky a loop we can create.
So I can imagine then, because using that kind of branching towards that, this must be a huge hit in the Hollywood circles or in the media circles, who maybe finally see this technology, these miles, as an opportunity to bring in their craft, their know-how, their capability to the table, and yet get the immersive, interactive, engaging feeling that comes from video games. Is that a proper statement? I mean, are you seeing uptick in that space towards what you're doing?
I think that there is a very strong desire from media companies to have more interaction, to add interactivity to their product that isn't just licensing their IP to a game developer and having that game developer make it. I think that they want to be able to apply their craft and add interactivity. The challenge for most of these is that adding interactivity isn't like adding 3D to a movie. It is a completely other dimension and it is hard to understand and fathom. And where the balance is between storytelling craft and interactive craft is the frontier that none of us have perfected yet or created a proper template for, nor is it the same for every project or IP. And so there is opportunity, but there is also challenge in how you design it and where we standardize that design.
So And like always, that infatuation that Hollywood and media has had with video games has always been a challenge because in the end, it's also understanding the language and the lexicon of production between both. But what I find to be fascinating about the entire concept of Miles as well is that it seems to be capturing the attention of what effectively is this changing demographic. The fact that Gen Z's here, we have these new concepts like the metaverse coming down, which I definitely want to get your take on, and the reality that not everybody wants to engage the same way. I mean, the thing is, what has been a video game and the involvement of a video game doesn't necessarily need to always remain with that 100% attention. That you can be passive, you can passively play, which I think is phenomenal. So, do you see Miles as a transition towards a metaverse? Where do you see that coming into the land where all of these things that are meta, as not as in the company, but actually just the metaverse, come together? Where's Miles' role in that?
If we look at what the difference between metaverse and a traditional video game land, I believe that's largely in the scale of the experience. Which is to say, a traditional video game will be sharded, will have a couple hundred people on a server at most. Everybody's experience will be isolated to that shard. And so it's not as though you've got a million people in the exact same game, or if you are EVE Online, you've had to slow your server down so much that you're basically playing a spreadsheet. That scale problem is a hard problem. It is a problem of network infrastructure, of server side hardware, and of game engines that will take probably a decade or more to really resolve to where you can have instances with supremely large numbers of users on it. I don't mean 1,000 or 10,000. I mean 1 million, 10 million people on that infrastructure. And then furthermore, how do you design experiences that are meaningful for 1 million people or 10 million people to be part of? You're not going to have a 10 million person battle royale. It's going to be boring. It's also probably going to take forever to play out. There's a reason that even though we could push toward 200, even 250 people on the server, in fact, PlanetSide did that years back, that most of the battle royales have settled on 100. It's a better design than having more people. So, how do you create design for the metaverse? What does it mean to have massive scale in 3D virtual worlds? None of us have the answer, but the one thing that actually does scale today to millions concurrently is video. In fact, it's probably the only thing that can scale to that level of people right now. So I believe that what we're doing here with Miles becomes this kind of bridge where we are able to test and figure out what does it mean for 1 million people, 3 million people, 5 million people to be part of the same story, to have their own ability to interact, to be able to engage. How many of those people want to lean back? How many of those people want to lean in? What does it mean when people start to be able to create their own avatar and have them sent into the television experience or the stream experience and see them be part of the story? How many people want to do that? What would they spend to do that? This is all of the types of experiments, the types of data that we're going to begin to generate in the Miles experiences that we're creating in the next few years. And I believe that the things that we pioneer are going to become some of the standard bearers for design when it comes to a true metaverse in the ensuing decade.
I totally agree with you on that. And, looking at it from that standpoint, the amount of data that must be generated from this is incredible. I find that having millions of people spectating and inputting and literally participating, it must give you an incredible data set. And that's going to be absolutely powerful for the way the metaverse comes together. And I'm curious about your take on this, Jacob, with the metaverse. I mean, you're a longtime games guy, you're a businessman, you have technology roots that go very deep. What is your take on the metaverse? I mean, is this just meta hype or is this really happening? What do you think?
Well, we have to start with definition because if we don't start there, then what your understanding of metaverse and my understanding of metaverse means could be different. And therefore, the words that I say could be interpreted wrongly to what it is I'm trying to get across. So the definition of metaverse, and I co-authored the Metaverse Primer with Matthew Ball. So if you read the network and the compute chapters of that 8-part primer, I wrote those with him. The definition that we came to agreement on between the two of us was basically a set of 3D virtual worlds that have persistency and massive scale. The definition is longer, but those are the key aspects of it. A lot of people try to shoehorn in AR, VR, or crypto. Those are actually not part of our definition of the metaverse if you go and you read it. And so I want to be very careful that I am not using the word metaverse here to refer to virtual reality, augmented reality, or crypto/blockchain. I think that those are ancillary and are tertiary things to the actual metaverse, which is basically a successor to the internet that is 3D rendered. And so, in my definition of that phrase, metaverse, I believe that this is an inevitability, which is to say the following. Compared to 10 years ago, more people spend time in virtual 3D rendered worlds today than 2011, and soon to be 2012, right, as we enter into 2022. That's just a truth. There is no way to argue against the fact that people spend more time in Fortnite and Roblox and Minecraft and what have you than 10 years prior. 10 years from now, people will be spending even more time in these virtual 3D worlds. Kids today grow up with Roblox. That is the way they spend time. They don't spend time necessarily on playing cards or doing the other kind of board game stuff, though I do try to play some board games with my son, relative to when previous generations were growing up. So the idea that you are spending your non-school hours inside of a 3D rendered virtual environment is the norm for them. And that's the current generation. Imagine the next generation. So it is an inevitability. And so the question is, as people spend more time in 3D rendered real-time virtual worlds, and using these words intentionally, right, to explain my definitions, are those virtual worlds going to hit scale? Are they going to be separated? Is there going to be a way to connect or join or jump from one to another? There's a reason that Epic always uses portals as a concept whenever you see them promoting Unreal Engine 5 or their own concepts of the metaverse. As you look at the fact that in Fortnite today, whether in the creative mode or otherwise, you can go and jump from an experience that is about shooting people to partying, being part of a concert, flying airplanes and helicopters and what have you. You see that the growth of these types of experiences are really just up to the imagination of us humans. Now, there is another kind of facet to this, which is the work side of it and the social side of it, and that's what you see Facebook and other platforms highly focused on. Horizons for work, social outings, what have you. The interesting thing is that a lot of the social aspects that we've been imagining are possible here have been folded into the games, which is to say, you can watch a movie in Fortnite, a concert in Fortnite, or hang out with your friends in Fortnite if you wanted to. And so those things are coming, they're there, and they already have game-like components and interactions to them. And going forward, you will do more learning inside of this. I don't mean that you go to school inside of Fortnite, but I mean the idea that there is educational Minecraft packs, or that you are being taught or learn how to do things through 3D virtual environments, solve puzzles, play like math games and things like that, is already the norm. My kid has a subscription to ABC Mouse, and he learns how to do puzzles and painting and math problems through these things. Those will become also part of large-scale virtual environments. The final frontier is probably work. Don't really know what that looks like. I think that a lot of the stuff out there today is probably just hype. But look, we'd spend most of our time on Zoom. So the idea that that gets augmented, not replaced, but augmented by some sort of 3D collaboration does seem right. Doesn't necessarily require a headset, doesn't necessarily mean weird play to earn stuff like what we're seeing people promote right now, but is also going to be inevitable because that is the direction we are on right now. And so you see me keep using this word inevitable because we are already on that path. We are already doing it. Every single day we spend more time in these virtual environments as humanity. And so it's not a question of whether the metaverse is or is not hype. There is a lot of incorrect definition, improper use of that word to augment people's own agendas rather than try to explain what's going to happen in the future. And so I take issue with that. And it's why you see me keep coming back to the question of definition. But that's where I think the rubber really meets the road.
No, I think that you hit that square on. The definition matters, and honestly, AR, VR to me are nothing more than input devices. It's ways
Correct.
that you experience something. So, as we go into that conversation about the metaverse and its reality, I also agree it's inevitable. The reality is 30 years ago, if you would have said, "Hey, you're going to be on something, a series of computers connected by TCP/IP that you might do shopping, emailing, and I mean, basically your entire life will be on," you would have laughed, been like, "Really?" And 30 years later, here we are, sitting in the same situation now looking at something called metaverse, which seems to be a catch-all phrase for everything that is under the sun in this side of the future internet. And it is inevitable because I look at my kids, 6 years old, 2 years old. For them, this technology has always existed. Whereas I think you and I remember a time where cell phones were new, where the internet was new, where just a personal computer was new. And what happens when that is just always have it has always been, just like films always were in our lives and our parents' lives. This is an inevitable change, and people are having those consumer habits. What I find fascinating about what you said, Jacob, and I think is really true, is that people like to take terms and shape them for their own use, right? Obviously, they can become very self serving. I mean, we're in business, we get it. Business people like to spin things around. Is there something that you believe the metaverse is not? Is there something that you say, you know what, that is not metaverse? Have you ran into anything like that and you're just like, okay, this is obviously way too a liberal use of the term? Or do you think it's just right now we're feeling it out, trying to understand what it really means?
I think that the most egregious to me is when people refer to Roblox is a metaverse and Fortnite is a metaverse and Call of Duty is a metaverse. Those are video games. Also, referring to
Yeah.
something as a metaverse is like referring to something as an internet. YouTube is an internet. Google is an internet. No, these are platforms, applications, databases, search engines on the internet. And so, if the metaverse is, by our definition, a successor to the internet, then nothing can be a metaverse. It is something in the metaverse, on the metaverse. And so, this is the most kind of pet peeve aspect of it for me. And I think that a lot of the times I tend to see the word metaverse be used in place of video game. It tends to be from people who are ignorant of the growth of our industry. And I also, this is somewhat corollary to it, but still important to me, tend to believe that a lot of the fascination with virtual currencies and with item transaction and the ideas of digital scarcity are coming from people who only started to realize that free to play gaming is a thing when our industry understood that 15 years ago, which is to say, the idea that you can sell virtual items and they have meaning to people and people are willing to spend on it is the backbone of the entire free to play industry of games, which is the majority of our industry, which generates hundreds of billions in revenue annually. And so, yes, we understood this in our industry. We understand how to create these things, and we have been doing so for quite a while now. So these kind of
So,
things do get me.
yeah. So let's talk about this because basically, I agree with you, the metaverse, no one owns the metaverse. The metaverse It's gigantic. It's sprawling. You're on the metaverse. You're in the metaverse, but you are not a metaverse. We're all building the metaverse. There's different permutations, but the reality is that it's internet. You might be a platform, you might be a destination, but you will not be the only one or the only thing, so to speak. Now, when we talk about Web3, because this is where people love to use this Web3 metaverse, and yet what they're talking about is a video game, because I also agree with you. Roblox is a video game, Fortnite is a video game. Do they have metaverse tendencies? Yes, they do. Are there things that will be exciting as they expand out? Of course they are. But the reality is that those are places, right? But when we start talking about Web3 and we talk about basically fungibility, because we can't go far without talking about cryptocurrency and blockchain. How do you see those things coming into play? Do you for instance, for with Miles, do you foresee a time where Miles connect with cryptocurrency where there is ownership of assets, or is that something that you're like, you know what, we're not going in that direction? I mean, how do you see that?
I think that a lot of the definitions and forced connections here tend to be by people who have significant interest in seeing something successful but are using these things wrongly, which is to say, I can create digital scarcity today. I don't need a blockchain. And ownership is really a question of your terms of service and privacy policies rather than a ledger or a database. In Axie Infinity, do you own your Axie? Not according to the terms of service. It doesn't matter what you have on the blockchain. Go read the terms of service for Axie. You don't have any rights to the visual depiction of the Axie. You can't put it in another game, even one that you make yourself, etc. And so what I tend to see, especially in this space, is people talking about ownership, but not actually granting ownership in the definition that you and I understand it. So I'm very careful and cognizant of this. Do I believe that people will be able to collect and create moments in Miles, do so with avatars that they participate in? Absolutely. Do I need a distributed database for that? No, I don't. And in fact, regular databases are far more efficient. The only thing that you really need a distributed database for is if you wanted something to outsurvive a company. But at that point, what's the point of doing those things? Which is to say, we create companies to generate value. We want to be able to create great experiences. If we don't have people making the game anymore, what's the point of the item? I'm not really sure that there is one. I'm not really sure that things without utility, apart from, you know, avant-garde art, really generate a lot of value from massive numbers of consumers. And I'm far more interested in a massive number of consumers than I am about a series of speculators whose primary motivation is to have things that increase in value. I'm also not convinced that value accretion or using games as places where you generate income are necessarily a good thing, which is to say, we experimented with this as an industry in Team Fortress 2, and in RMT, in WoW, and Diablo. We found that it broke our economies and determined that the game experience was less fun. And if a game is not played for fun, it becomes work. And if it becomes work, work needs to generate value for the entirety of the ecosystem, or it starts to break down. So I don't really prescribe to the idea that any of the quote unquote Web3 concepts have much to do about metaverse. I think that they've been artificially argued to be some by people who have significant stake in trying to convince others that it's part of it, but I don't see that as dissimilar to VR and AR too, which is to say, I agree with you that virtual and augmented reality are basically input and output devices, right? A headset is an output device that you watch a 3D virtual world from. And I think that crypto is just a distributed database that you can make a decision whether it is or is not beneficial to you. But a technology solution doesn't resolve for the business problems of ownership, and ownership is really just a question of what I put in my TOS.
So then at that moment in time, if Axie's terms of service were to say you actually own the rights, everything behind it, would you feel differently? Or is it just primarily that overall it's not necessarily something that you think is, I guess I
But
would say
that
valuable,
proves
but
my point here, which is to say that's a business decision, not a technology one.
that's very true. And so that's okay. So then this is the thing then. When we sit back and we think about, say, like play to earn, because definitely in parts of the world, the ability, like say, like the Philippines, like we actually had the people from Yield Guild Games, Gabby Dizon from Yield Guild here to talk about how play to earn has basically started to transform work in the Philippines because they're literally taking people who earn wages of 250 a month, and they're making thousands of dollars now playing this game. It's completely changed their lives. That is a real world application of basically a game turning into utility that helps someone basically earn an income in that part of the world and basically in much of the emerging markets. I get it. I mean, are we going to do that in Provo, Utah? Probably not. But the fact that it does exist and that it is working, I find it fascinating. And I'm curious, in your perspective, as you see Miles coming together, do you see it only then primarily as an entertainment source? Or do you think there will be other applications for it? Like, will we do conferences or educational seminars, or will it only be for entertainment?
I think that at the end of the day, games are built for entertainment. And when it comes to play to earn, most Ponzi schemes work at the start of them. So most of these applications only work when there is enough fun to be had that people are willing to pay into it. I'm not sure that many of these games are fun enough that spending $1,000 on them up front is really worth it to the number of people that need to be there to make that ecosystem work beyond speculators.
Get your point. So basically, at that moment in time, then uh, I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but we're basically like taking that the the judge is still out in terms on if this is real value or if it is a Ponzi scheme or if it's anything else that's going to create anything other than a pyramid at the top. Where MLM works the same way. I mean, that's
Yes,
one
well,
way we
look,
can.
at the end of the day, in order for those economics to work, I need to be willing to spend enough money to cover your costs for when you had been playing,
Hmm.
right? If I'm going
Right.
to buy a character from you, I need to say, I'm going to have so much fun in this product that it is worth X thousands of dollars of fun to me.
Hmm.
And I am not attempting to then just speculate and sell this to the next person. Because unless somebody is willing to come into the ecosystem and say, you know what, my job is not here to speculate. I'm not working necessarily. I'm here purely to have fun and pay into it without taking out of this ecosystem. The rest of it falls apart.
Okay.
Are
No,
there
I got you.
people who are spending so much hours, so much time, and so much money in these ecosystems that justifies their spend purely on fun without them needing to take out of the ecosystem? Remains to be seen.
That'd be a good question for me to ask the guys at Axie. Actually, I'm fascinated by that. Is actually a very good question, and I'm sure that's something that our listeners are probably wondering about too. It's like how many of your users are just doing it for pure fun versus those trying to earn a living or speculating.
Yeah, but earning a living always comes down to the concept of earning, which is to say, if you're working,
Hmm.
work is the provision of utility for others. What's the utility you're providing here? I understand that when you are, for example, mining ore, teaching children, coding
Hmm.
something that someone else will use, farming. There is utility here. Human needs that, right? We trade one object for another. That is
Right.
all the economic system is. What are we trading here in these games? We are trading our effort for fun.
Okay.
And if the
Yes.
result isn't fun, then it breaks down.
Interesting. Okay. So let me ask you then, as we're getting towards the end of the show, the future, Genvid, where are you guys going? I mean, you're pioneering Miles. You guys have been basically creating great content. Where do you see this going? And ultimately, what's the I can say end game because I don't think there's ever an end in mind. But what to you is the ultimate for what you think Genvid and Miles can become?
Next year, we will launch the sequel to Rival Peak. It won't be Rival Peak 2 in the same way that Niantic didn't make Ingress 2, they made Pokemon Go, right? So we're going to be working with very large IP partners and creating stories of significant scale, IP in worlds that people love, interactive streaming shows with characters that they care about. And the audience will be able to create their own, as I mentioned before, avatar, and be able to have them be part of the stream, be part of the show. You will not just watch, you will be able to participate. You will generate influence points for yourself and be able to bid against the rest of the audience to make decisions. You will join social groups and factions when you're making these decisions and be able to pool your points together to help shape the outcome of a story, not just your story, because there is no your story in the Genvid product, but the story for everyone, the canon, the one canon that exists, because we're not sharded. And so as we create more and more of these experiences, I hope to prove out what does ARPPU and conversion look like here? How big of an audience is there? What happens when we take this truly cross-platform? Because we are video, and video is the only true successor to Flash, which is to say it works at the same fidelity on any device that you are on. Anywhere that a Netflix app can live, our video can live. Desktop, mobile, televisions, game consoles. You'll see our products go cross-platform on all of those. Free to play, with the ability for you to create avatars and spend to influence the story, or just participate, generate influence points without having to spend a dime to be part of that story. How good a storyteller we become, where these worlds go, I don't have an answer for that yet, but that's the opportunity I see for us.
I mean, from my standpoint, you guys end up becoming a next generation media company because that's everything you just told me and just what you just expressed on this here and on the podcast. What I mean is that I mean, you're completely transforming media. That's always how it has struck me. But honestly, I think the play for you and Genvid, from what I've seen, is just beyond games. I mean, it's literally everything that has to do with just the way we are interacting. And I find your technology so fascinating and how you guys have been able to put this business together. And I know this has been a labor of love for you and a passion. And so one thing I would love is for the entrepreneurs that are out there, the people that are grinding, trying to make it happen. Do you have any advice for them? You know, people that want to come up and say, "Hey, you know, I want to be like Jacob. I want to make it too." What would you tell them? What advice could you offer?
There are two things when it comes to building a company and running a startup. One, you have to have incredibly strong conviction in what you do, but also paired with that conviction, knowledge, insight, network, and the ability to do everything as you need to do it. Two, you need to have actual experience in your industry and field. I spent a decade plus in gaming before I went and I started this company. Without that, I don't think I could do what it is that I do. Pair experience with a strong conviction, and you'll have success. Without that, it's going to be a very tough road.
Jacob, I want to thank you on behalf of all of the audience and listeners out there today that have heard this inspirational and innovative story. Thank you so much for coming on the show. For people that want to follow you, how can they reach out? How can they basically just keep following you and Genvid? What's your social tags? Where can they get information?
I'm on Twitter at Navok. That's the letter J, then my last name, Navok, Navok. You can also follow Genvid Tech, GenvidTech on Twitter. And of course, go ahead and play PacMan Community, which is live on Facebook right now.
That's awesome. Well, everyone, that comes to an end this edition of Video Games Real Talk. We want to thank you all, as always, for listening. As always, please feel free to comment, share, like, and of course, let us know what you love and hate about the show. We will be coming to you again next week with another exciting episode. Until then, please check out videogamesrealtalk.com. Hit us up on Twitter at VGRT, or you can hit me up at StarvUp. And as always, keep making those games, keep following, keep grinding. It'll come true. Thanks again for listening.